This is Intentional Conversations. This is our version of a podcast consisting of video recordings with a live virtual audience. So we're so glad that you all are here now. I appreciate the fact that many of you return every single Friday, and that is fantastic. So we have two areas for chatting. I always like to make sure that I remind this audience to use the stage area for all of your chats. That's so that we all can be a part of whatever communications and interactions are taking place. And so make sure you're using the stage and not the event area for our chatting today. So I'm so excited for our guest co-host. Before we actually jump into that, I have a special announcement that is only available for this community and this community only. So many of you may or may not be aware that one of our clients is the Greenville Chamber based in Greenville, South Carolina. And we have been operating as their consultant partner in the DEI space for quite a number of years. And one of the great things that we get to do for them is to design this conference experience. And so on October 20th, this coming Tuesday, it's a full day diversity, equity, and inclusion conference. And I want to shift and show you a quick video of it because for the first 20 to 30 people that actually, after the end of today's IC, send myself an email to say that you're interested and available to attend the full day, you're going to get a free complimentary pass. And that is a value of $200, actually $199 to be exact, but $200 to round it up. And I think that you're certainly going to find it of value. And so take a listen to this video, and then I look forward to hopefully having some of you to take me up on this offer. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natasha. I'm being supported today, by the way, by Natasha Poritskova, Elvia Pacheco Flores. Those are two DEI managers on the team, as well as Anna Viola Gutman, who serves as the Chief of Staff for Nika Consulting. So I want to jump right in. And again, just remind you, I'll put this into the chat, but the first 30 people from this community to email me at nika@nikawhite.com will receive a complimentary pass to the DEI Summit. That again is Tuesday, October the 20th. And so let's jump right in. This is a time for us to intersect conversations that address diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business. So go to the next slide for me, please. I always like to make sure that you all can follow me on social media. So here are my platforms. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Natasha. And my website is nikawhite.com. Again, we are a management consulting firm that intersects the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business. So we work with all types of clients, private, public sector, different industries, different sizes, helping them to integrate into their business frameworks, strategic diversity, intentional inclusion, and a lens of equity. I always like to point you to our website because there are a myriad of complementary resources to help you lead more inclusively, like white papers, blog articles. We have short videos that are called Inclusion Uncomplicated, all to help you simplify DEI. So I encourage you to take advantage of those. Next slide, please, Natasha. Now, I want to give you a little bit of information about who you can expect to see in the upcoming weeks on our Intentional Conversations. Next week, we have Victoria Chance and Mary Ann Inglis, and they're going to be talking about their work in the nonprofit space of My Neighbor's Voice and how it supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's next week from 11 to 12 noon. And the week following that, on October 30th, I have a really great friend. Her name is Raven Solomon, and she is like this expert on multi-generations in the workplace. Very specifically, she is a guru on the young professionals, the millennials in the workplace. And so look forward to having her join us on October 30th. And so if you have someone in your network that you think would make a remarkable guest for Intentional Conversations podcast, we encourage you to send that information to us. We love getting guest recommendations from those who are part of this community. And so send them directly to Natasha, Natasha, at nikawhite.com. I'm going to have someone to put that into the chat for us so you'll know. Again, you can reference that email, but it's Natasha at nikawhite.com. We'd love to get your recommendations. So thank you in advance. Now, this leads us to why we're here today. Again, Intentional Conversations podcast. So go to the next slide. And what I want to do is just touch quickly on some of the agreements that I want us to all partner on to help optimize our time together today. So go to the next slide. And the first is just understand we're here to learn with and from each other. So we want to create a strong sense of community. So use that stage area for chatting. If you have some key resources that you think this group would benefit from, we want to hear those. Although the topics may vary, one of the things that connects each one of our sessions from week to week is the fact that we intersect diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership and business. But we're also very respectful of what's top of mind for each of us with the global pandemic and the racial inequity crisis. And so I'm certain that some of that will be touched on, as well as any other current events that are happening this week. This is an opportunity to provide a pathway to dynamic knowledge for you all to be engaged with, so that, again, we can learn how to lead more inclusively and to strategize ways to propel ourselves both personally and professionally. The session is being recorded and will be shared this afternoon along with the chat room transcript. So without further ado, I want to introduce my special guest co-host today. And she's actually a friend. We've been connected for, quite some time. And so I'm so excited to be able to share space with her today. I want to give her a proper introduction before I have her to greet you in her own way. Jessica Sharp is passionate about supporting underserved and minority communities, diverse representation, and brain education. We're going to hear all about that. Jessica is the founder and CEO of Sharp Brain Consulting, a brain-based organizational development firm. Through her work with SBC, she is working to transform organizations through education about the brain. Additionally, she serves as an adjunct faculty member with the Organizational and Leadership Psychology Department at William James College. Jessica works to improve her local community through her involvement in a variety of organizations, including the Junior League of Greenville, the United Way of Greenville, and the Greenville Theater. She is a graduate of Leadership Greenville and is a diversity fellow with the Riley Institute and has been recognized for her work to better the Greenville community. She regularly speaks about various topics related to the brain. Jessica has a master's of public affairs from the University of Missouri and is currently a student at William James College, where she is obtaining a doctorate in leadership psychology. In her free time, Jessica enjoys reading, listening to podcasts, and spending time with friends and family. Welcome, my friend. I'm so glad.
Hello. I'm so happy we get to do this.
I as well. So I always like to start by saying I want to give people a proper introduction. I want them to know why we saw it fit to bring you here as a co-host to share with this community. But what can people know about you that they can't find in their bio? In your bio, what's your story?
So other things that I think about me, I'll give you kind of just some fun things about me. You obviously could gather from my bio that I'm incredibly passionate about the community, about working to empower what are traditionally marginalized communities. But I am very I'm into politics. That's something you probably wouldn't be able to gather from my bio. It's a hobby of mine, if that even, makes sense. I work still kind of, essentially from a consulting perspective with a program called Youth in Government, which Nika's son actually participated in. And I'm trying to think of some other just fun things. I pretty much on a daily basis quote either Cory Booker, who is a senator from New Jersey, he's a hero of mine, or Brene Brown, who is a social worker by training. You can generally hear that I'm quoting one of those two people on a regular basis. So those are just kind of some other random fun things to know about me.
Cory Booker and Brene Brown, certainly two names that everyone in this community should know and follow. Their leadership and their approach is just phenomenal. Daring Greatly is a book that probably many of you are familiar with. So yeah, those are two of my favorites as well. So let's jump right in. I want to ask first, what was the catalyst that led you to starting Sharp Brain Consulting?
Yeah,
you're now.
I know. I never thought I would be. And so, it's a really funny, kind of story because I traditionally have been very averse to entrepreneurship. I thought it was great for other people, but I certainly didn't ever think that that this would be the path that I went down. But I was several years ago, I was working actually with a friend of Nika and mine, and I was doing diversity work. And I was doing essentially a bit of internal consulting. And I just kept saying to myself, oh my goodness, wouldn't it be great if we did different sorts of training on the front end, different sorts of, work with employees so that they essentially wouldn't be in my office having to deal with whatever issue we were dealing with. And I was like, oh my goodness, I think I want to do consulting. So I formed and created Sharp Brain Consulting several years ago, but it was small on purpose. It was something I kind of just did a little bit in the background. It allowed me to do different things than what I was doing in my full-time work. And I just thought, oh, I'll just keep it around forever, and never really thought that it would be what I'm doing full-time. But it has kind of ebbed and flowed a bit as my work and particularly education has shifted. But over the past, I don't know, several set of months, both because of COVID, but then everything that's happening, depending on who you quote, it's either a moral reckoning or a racial reckoning. Like every other consultant in the world who does anything related to D&I, my plate has gotten awfully full. And so it was such where I was able to make this my full-time gig. And I've even hired a staff person since then, who, thank goodness for her, because I kind of I can't manage anything else at this point without her. But yeah, it felt like I wanted to be able to help better support people in organizations and wanted to have a little bit more control over what I was doing with people.
Well, let me be the first to say, my friend, you were born for this. I remember all of those one-to-one lunches and talks, and you said, I'm kind of toying with the idea of, some consulting work. And then when you told me that you were going to pursue your doctorate, I was like, yes, go, Jessica. This is so awesome. So seeing you blossom and really in your space and your element has been so much fun to watch. And so I just want to tell you that I'm proud of you. I am incredibly proud. And in fact, I think it was, you mentioned this is a mutual friend, and maybe some in this community know who we're talking about, but her name is Keneal Coltman. And I remember when you told me, Nika, I have this fascination with the brain. We were at, I think, like her baby shower, I believe, when you first mentioned it to me.
Might have been.
And I was like, what? What do you mean? What do you mean? You're just really intrigued with the brain. And that ended up being somewhat of the basis of how you landed at this place and this sweet spot and this niche that you have built for yourself. And so for those who may not know, what is a brain-based organizational development firm? Let's educate us, please, Jessica.
Right. Yeah. I've started adding to my website, what do some of these things mean? Because I tell folks and they're like, that sounds interesting, but I don't really know what that means. So I'll kind of break it apart and tell you first, what does organizational development mean? And I know that your community probably already understands that, but just to make sure we have a shared language, organizational development is a field. It's a science-based field where essentially we go into organizations and help support them to be more effective. So organizational development measures are planned. They generally are organizational wide. They often are kind of led from the top down. And so essentially what I do is go into organizations, kind of can look and identify what are the challenges, and then walk the leaders and the staff people along a journey where they're really working actively to rebuild the organization and to tweak things. And so that's what OD is. And the brain-based piece is that everything I do essentially is rooted in the brain. So I spend a lot of time talking about the brain. When I'm giving recommendations, oftentimes they are at a minimum with the brain in mind. And I do a lot of trainings and things on here's how to maximize our brain essentially to better inform organizations. So I kind of have this intersection of OD work, so improving organizations, but then doing it so much with the brain in mind and teaching folks how to basically essentially maximize their brain.
Yeah, and so much of this work of helping people to solve for how to effectively address spaces that need to have that level of inclusion and equity and belonging, it does start with the cerebral, right? How can we make sure that we understand where these actions are coming from, especially as we talk about unconscious bias, implicit bias, or I like to refer to it as conscious inclusion to put the positive spin on it. So I'm so intrigued by how you have carved out a very specific approach to talking about this work. And I love that. And so what sparked your interest to work in brain education?
Yeah, I mean, all but like consulting, I kind of fell into it. I'm so much of a planner, but I keep just falling into things. So I started my career teaching at a Teach for America, and I taught in Charlotte, which is, for most folks probably are at least know the area enough. I know you've got folks from all over the country, but it's close to where Nika and I are based in South Carolina. But I taught in Charlotte, and through Teach for America, they give you a tremendous amount of training. And so one of the books that we read that is still on my bookshelf right here, I could reach for it if I wanted to, is called Teaching with the Brain in Mind. And that was really the first kind of introduction to the brain I had. And so I read that book, and it informed my teaching, and, I taught and all of that. When I stopped teaching, I moved back here to Greenville, where I still am. And I started working at the YMCA with teens. And all of a sudden, I found myself asking myself, why do teenagers behave the way that they do pretty consistently? And then I asked myself, why do young people who are living in poverty have very similar ways that they interact and engage? And I thought, well, I remember I read that book about the brain. Let me start digging into it. So ultimately, my journey into the brain was honestly me just trying to figure out how to best serve teens, and specifically how to best serve teens who are currently living in poverty. And so I started this whole, what I now call a love affair with the brain, learning specifically about brain development and the teen brain. And then essentially, the more that I learned about the brain, the more that I wanted to learn about the brain. And so now I do a tremendous amount of work thinking about doing research on the brain as it relates to essentially different parts of the brain. So the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and then I do a lot of research on basically how my work intersects with the brain. But it was just really me trying to figure out how can I best improve my work with young people. And then the journey just kind of never has ended.
That is great. So Jessica, help us to connect the dots. How does your interest and your research and your in-depth knowledge of the brain help you to do your consulting work in the space that you do it in? So diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice. Talk to us about the connection point there.
Yeah, I mean, the connection points are pretty significant. So when we think specifically about DE&I work, right, which is, I mean, just so much of what I'm doing right now, certainly as anybody who does anything with DE&I work, we're doing a lot of it right now. When you think about that, there are a few topics that particularly kind of, we can pull out things like unconscious bias, which I think, Nika, you and I will dig some more into. But what is, it is that there's this intersection of, in order for us to basically better improve our actions and to tweak and shift how we're showing up in terms of interpersonal relationships, in terms of leadership and organizations, all of that, it requires us to shift our brain. And so if I want to transform my leadership and I want to be a more equitable leader, I have to, one, learn, which means putting information in our brain, right? And there's some adult development theories about how to teach adults versus teaching young people. But then also I have to shift how I communicate, how I show up with people. And so much of that goes back to essentially brain development. And there's some tricks that that I teach people on in terms of brain, but I've got to shift what's happening up here in order to shift what's happening in my interpersonal relationships.
That is so true. And I often talk with audiences about, in order to do this work effectively, we have to shift the paradigm, which definitely is a shift in our mindset, to where we're not seeing this work as obligation. And when I say this work, I'm talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we see it as an opportunity. And that does require a shift in our mindset. But I think that the value of that is so critical to the outcomes, because if we're seeing this work of DEI as an obligation, then we're asking the question of our organizations, how can we help advance DEI? But if we see it as an opportunity, we begin to ask the question, how can diversity, equity, and inclusion and intentionality in that space help us as an organization, help me personally as a leader? And so I think that is such an incredible way to talk about it, is to get people to see the science behind how we can land at destinations that we want to be at in terms of how people show up and how they feel. So I want to shift now and talk about empathy, because I know that that is a big part of your work as well. And so you're a firm believer that, just generally speaking, there's a lack of empathy in people. We don't really exercise, the ability to show up with the high level of compassion and empathy. And right now we know that we need it so much more than any time ever, right? So can you explain why there isn't enough empathy in our society and what people can do about it?
Yeah. So my hero, Cory Booker, who again I'm about to quote him and Brene. It sometimes happens where it's both of them. So I have read his book now, I think twice, and he says that we have a poverty of empathy, and I agree, right? We just have a deficit of empathy. And the way that Brene Brown, she talks about empathy, she uses a definition from Teresa Wiseman, who's a nursing scholar. But essentially, empathy is feeling with people. It involves perspective taking, really trying to understand what is this other person feeling and experiencing. And so a few things that I think about that I think are important to share about empathy. First, there's this concept in psychology called in-group versus out-group. And we have various in groups, right? So for me, I am a Black woman. So that's my group, right? Black women are my group, but then also I am a Southerner, right? And I very much so identify as a Southerner. I'm in the junior league. I feel very connected to people in the junior league. So we have these various in groups. We have less natural empathy for people who are in our out group. There's some research that supports that, because essentially it's easier for me to say, well, if you're a woman, or if you're, in the junior league, if you're in my group, I can just understand a little bit more about what you're experiencing. So that's just important to know. Those kind of two concepts. Additionally, what's important to know is that, empathy is generally always important, but right now, when we're thinking about COVID, for many of us, we are experiencing a threat response from a brain perspective. Our brains and certain levels of hormones in our brains are elevated very long beyond what they are supposed to be elevated to. So we are, whatever our default stress behavior is, particularly the ones that are less than positive, we're feeling a lot of that, right? So we are stressed, we are burnout, we are all collectively grieving, we are just feeling a lot of things, right? So one, that means it's a little bit harder for us to be empathetic of others because we're so focused on what's happening internally. Second, a lot of us, because we are trying to be safe, are doing more things from behind a computer screen. And it is much easier to be less empathetic, less kind when I'm typing behind a computer screen, as opposed to when I'm seeing someone, I'm seeing their facial expressions, I'm in the same space with them, right? So right now, and not to mention too, the third thing is we're in political season. We got a campaign, an election in 23, 24 some odd days, right? So, we've got all of these ingredients that mean that it is a time both when we have less empathy naturally, but when we need a lot more of it, right? So I'm doing a lot of thinking about empathy because I think that empathy is required really in general. But if we're thinking about DE&I work, I think it's required. I do a lot, almost exclusively, most of my work is in the public sector. And in order to support communities who, need some uplifting, need some walking alongside, all of those things, we have to understand, or at least strive to understand, what is it like to not know where your next meal is coming from? What is it like to have a young person who can't read? What is it like to worry about when you're going to pay your bills, right? We have to have that level of empathy. So, in summary, we are in this place where we have a deficit of empathy, but we need a lot more empathy. And so it's just really an unfortunate mix.
I 100% agree with that. In fact, you heard us talk a couple times today about the DEI Summit. Our closing keynote speaker, her name is Martez, and she's actually been a guest co-host on Intentional Conversations. And she is this expert on empathy in the workplace. So she's really going to unpack that at an in-depth level. And I think that it's going to resonate with a lot of what you're sharing with this community today, because as you mentioned, right now, there's so many different competing things that's causing us to not necessarily be at our best because of the level of uncertainty. And as you mentioned, the threats that we are, feeling a little bit of anxiety around, and all of that impacts how in which we're showing up. And I think that right now, one of the best things that leaders can do is to try to increase their level of empathy and compassion and understanding, as we all kind of grapple with, again, a lot of these complexities. And you even mentioned political. You're right. I've heard of a lot of people that have already made decisions from an organizational perspective to have the day of, and the day after elections as a day off, paid day off, because they want to, I guess, apparently give people time to settle into their thoughts and their emotions so that won't carry over into the interactions in the workplace. But all of these are certainly things to understand. And so, yeah, you're getting some people that are resonating and affirming your thoughts. Frank says, see to understand. I agree so much. Allows us to speak our truths. Yeah, so that's awesome. That's great. So, and by the way, please continue to keep engaging in our chat. We do appreciate that. And if you have questions, I know this has been posted. Certainly make sure that you put your questions out there, because we will shift at some point and take questions from each of you. And I also just want to acknowledge our Facebook Live audience that's watching as well. So we appreciate you being engaged in this conversation. So you said that we were going to get to unpack unconscious bias a little bit further. So now we're at that place, and it's the topic that I know a lot of DEI practitioners or have really a lot of passion and energy around, because it's so critically important. So when were you first aware that unconscious bias was going to be a pretty important topic to this work of helping to, again, dismantle microaggressions, systemic racism, all of these other issues that leads to people feeling oppressed, unaccepted, a lack of belonging in the workplace? And then how do you try to solve for that as you're working with clients?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's such an important topic, right, to talk about bias. So when I worked with our friend Keneal, doing diversity and inclusion work was really the first time I'd become really intimately aware of bias, right? I'm sure that I macro level knew about it, but I didn't really know about bias, right? So I began to dig into the research, right? And in so many ways, I have always been a researcher even before, I was in a doctoral program. And so, I started to dig into the research. And when I did, I thought, oh my goodness, we need to all be talking about bias, which I'm on a bit of a personal mission to do right now. But what I think is so important, and this community probably certainly understands bias, right? The stories we make up about groups of people, but what I think is so important to really think about is the neuroscience behind bias, and the fact that I can say all day long, I'm a good person, I care about equity, I care about inclusion, and I can consciously believe that. But that doesn't mean that I won't have biases pop up that impact how I show up, right? And the reality is we are more likely, going back to that in-group, out-group thing, we're more likely to have negative biases, negative stories against people who are in our out-groups, right? And who are different from us, right? And that kind of goes back to thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, I mean, to me, the thing that is so important and so critical to understand the science behind bias and to understand your own individual unconscious bias, right? And I've, been really intimately aware of bias for, at this point, about 5 or 6 years. And because it's like a muscle, right? You get better at it with time. I can pretty quickly acknowledge and feel when a bias is popping up, and I'm able to basically stop it in its tracks and shift much more quickly because I've been doing this work for some time. So it gets easier is what I want people to know. But also, I think that there's kind of several steps, and there's this, fantastic TEDx talk from Verna Myers. And so I always encourage folks, if you have somebody who doesn't understand bias and hadn't gone to this sort of conversation or training, share that video with them because it's really great. But, I think there's several different steps to really dealing with unconscious bias, because the data that I've done on the brain and on bias makes me think biases don't go away, but we can certainly better control how we are engaging with others. So, first, you've got to understand your unconscious biases, and that implicit bias association test is a great one. I'm sure you all have taken it. If you haven't, projectimplicit.org is, go there, take that assessment. I've had folks say that they are frustrated about the directions and that it kind of shifts on you. Well, that's on purpose, because we need your amygdala based response. This is in the limbic system of your brain, and it's a quicker part of the brain. But then once you are able to identify your unconscious biases, you've got to understand, when you're more likely to engage in bias and make a bias-based decision. And then, you've got to, and Natasha's put the link in the chat, but you've got to begin to really shift how you're interacting with others. Because again, the biases won't go away. The bias that, the one that I often think about hadn't gone away in 5 or 6 years. But I'm able to shift my interpersonal one-on-one interactions and relationships. And so I think, it is critical. To me, it almost feels like, I call it sometimes a threshold issue. If you want to dig into DE&I work, which I hope we all do, certainly all of you probably want to, or you wouldn't be here. But if you want to dig into this work, you have to understand bias. You got to understand it on a macro level, and you got to understand how it personally impacts you, right? In order to really, really do this work well. So to me, it's like, I don't like a checkbox, right? I don't like that in terms of this work, but it is certainly certainly you've got to check that off the list first at a minimum, understanding it and beginning to do the work internally if you're going to really effectively do DE&I work.
I totally agree. So Judith Prince has asked for us to repeat the source of the bias test, and I think you mentioned that projectimplicit.org.
Yep, and I just put that in the link for Judy.
Yep. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. You're dropping some really good nuggets and great resources. So I am loving and appreciative of my team that's on it to make sure this community gets those resources. And if you're not familiar with Bernie Myers, please do check out that TED Talk. She is amazing. She has her own consulting firm in this space, very astute DEI practitioner. She is credited for coining the phrase that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. But her TED Talk is amazing. I want to stay here for a bit longer because I think this topic of unconscious bias, implicit bias is so important. I feel like sometimes people can be defensive because maybe it's like, no, I'm not biased. But if you have warm blood running through your body, you have the propensity for bias to creep into your psyche, into your interactions, your decision-making ability. And it doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human. But it also does not exonerate us from the consequences of our actions. And so, again, it goes back to that intent versus impact. You can say, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that that was creating a negative, implication for someone else. Well, when you step on my toe, even though you say you're sorry, I can forgive you, but my toe still hurts, right? And so I think it's just important for us to realize our own personal responsibility for trying to mitigate and solve for our biases. And there are ways to do that. Sometimes people, when they hear the brain side of it, they're thinking, well, that's just how we are. I can't help that I have bias. No, you can't help that you have it, but you can help control for it. And that takes being exposed to how bias shows up, right? So that you can begin to recognize it. And if you can recognize it, then you're able to then start to mitigate it. Are there any other tips that comes to your mind that you think would be important to share with this community that can help them, again, to mitigate bias? When you do see it show up, what can you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I talk about a lot, I feel like in general, but certainly in the context of bias, is mindfulness and meditation, which can feel like, why in the world are we having that conversation, right? But follow me, it's because of where bias lives in the brain. So I've mentioned just very high level, it's in the limbic system. Bias lives in the amygdala, which just by golly does all kinds of things. But one of the things that it does is it's responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze response, or threat response. It just does all kinds of things. It's wildly powerful. But when that part of our brain is engaged, right, particularly when it takes over when we have a threat response, it's called an amygdala hijack. I mean, it messes up essentially our ability to do any sort of conscious thinking. And so one of the things that we can do to basically calm down our amygdala is mindfulness, which is basically the art of just being very here in the present moment, which is hard, right? I mean, I've got an Apple Watch, an iPhone, I've got, Mac, I've got notifications, all kinds of things telling me where I'm supposed to be and who I'm supposed to be reaching out to, right? So I recognize that it's hard. Meditation is a fantastic tool for mindfulness, really just sitting down and doing several deep belly breaths or really getting some oxygen to your brain can help calm your brain down. There's Dax Shepard has a podcast. He's an actor, but Laurie Santos, who some of you may have heard of, she teaches a class at Yale. It's the most popular class at Yale, and it's about happiness. She's got a Happiness Lab podcast as well. She does this. She has a really great way of explaining basically the way that that mindfulness and meditation helps, but it basically tricks your brain into thinking that there's not a threat and that you're able to be calm. So when you're engaging with someone who fits into a bias category for you, right? One of just the quick, free ways that you can help to decrease the likelihood that you will make a bias-based decision is to take several deep breaths, right? For me, when I'm engaging in someone who I know that I have just on a macro level a negative bias towards, one of the things that I would do is basically prep myself in advance and say, listen, I know that you've got, this is me talking to myself now. I know that you may have a bias that impacts this person, but it's really important to not let that creep up. And then I'm going to take several very deep breaths and try to be really, really here in the present moment, right? Gosh, it's fantastic. Natasha, put that episode in the chat. You move so quick, Natasha. I'm so here for it. That's a great episode.
She's awesome.
really engaging in mindfulness can calm your brain down and just give you more control of your brain. The other thing is self-care, which, millennials, my age group, we have hijacked self-care, y'all, and we have turned it into meaning bubble baths and wine. And if you like bubble baths and wine, that's fine. I'm happy for that to be your self-care. But ultimately, as a reminder, self-care is just giving yourself whatever you need to be at your best, right? So, for me, it's 8 hours of sleep and a massage once a month because I carry tension in my body, right? And so, and again, I say that because when you were at your best, right? When you're rocking on all cylinders and you were like, yes, I could conquer the world today. You've got more control. And so you're just better able to control what's happening in your brain and therefore the way that you're interacting with people. So, Nika, I just cannot agree with you more that the science is clear. We've all got bias. It'll make you a good person, it'll make you a bad person. It makes you a human with a brain, right? That's all that it means. But just because you have it, it doesn't mean that you are, basically beholden to unconscious bias. You absolutely have the ability, to work through bias and to allow it to, to not impact every single interaction you have. So mindfulness, meditation, and a whole lot of deep breaths are really going to help kind of shift and change the game.
No, I totally agree. And so I'm going to ask my team there's a white paper that I produced maybe about a year or so ago, and it's all on mindfulness to help mitigate unconscious bias. And it talks about the breathing and some of the other factors. And so if we could find that, put it into the chat for this community, that would be great. So we are getting some questions and I'm loving that. We're going to shift to the questions momentarily. I have maybe one or two more and then we'll take some audience questions. So keep that coming. So I want to talk about emotional intelligence. And I know that you've been also doing research into the intersection of EQ and inclusion work. So can you expound upon that and share some of your findings with us?
Yeah, so I'm kind of working on this larger theory, if you will, around equity, emotional intelligence, and empathy, right? The 3 E's is probably what I ought to start calling it. But emotional intelligence is essentially the ability to, to be aware of our emotions, to control them, and then also, to increase our ability to have strong interpersonal relationships. So it also requires that we're able to identify emotions in others and to essentially control our responses to others, right? And the reality is, I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it can be hard, right? I was talking to a client yesterday and she was like, it shouldn't be hard, right? It should be easy. It should be about humanity. And I'm like, I know. But it can be hard, right? So, and I, as I mentioned, I do so much work in the public service sector. And so I'm working with marginalized communities and the stakes are really, really high for them, right? I've got freshmen who can't read who I'm working with. It is important that they, the stakes are just so high. They're freshmen, they can't read, right? So this work is really important. And for so many people, it gets really emotional. It does not take much at all for me to get on a soapbox about equity or social justice because I am very emotionally invested in this work, right? And so because of that, if my emotions are really high and I'm, interacting with somebody who maybe doesn't agree with me, their emotions might get high, right? And then we're having conversations that they're just not going to be successful, quite frankly, right? They're not going to meet our goal. We're not going to be able to move forward because our amygdalas are engaged and we can't think straight, right? Because literally we can't. And so I think that it's really important to understand your emotions, understand, the importance of emotions. They impact so many things about what we think, how we see people, all sorts of things. And to me, the research is making me kind of work towards the thought that in order to do equity work well, I have to both understand my emotional response to really anything, but particularly this work. And I have to be able to see others' responses because, if I'm really passionate about an issue and I'm, angry about something and the other person is angry too, and it's the opposite opinion, I've got to be able to control certainly how I feel, but try to maybe figure out how to navigate that conversation in a way where we can say, well, wait a minute, let's take a step back, let's slow down, what's the goal of the conversation, that sort of thing. So I feel like in order to do equity work well, particularly if you want to lead this work, right? If you're a leader in an organization, I think you've got to be emotionally intelligent, right? And Daniel Goleman talks about EQ, and he, lots of people say it's more important than IQ, and in order to be a successful leader anyway, you've got to have a lot of EQ. But I think there's really an overlap here, and I think in order to do this work well, you've got to have a handle on emotions and emotional responses.
No, I definitely agree. And as you mentioned, there's so much that's triggering about the current climate we're in and this work. And the fact alone is that having a conversation about race and racism in and of itself is complicated for a lot of people. It's very uncomfortable. And so we do have to make sure we are easing into those conversations in a way where we're choosing courage over comfort, but that emboldens us to still do so, because the hard conversations have to happen. The work is not going to go away. The need for it's not going to go away if we decide to ignore it and not talk about it. So yeah, I love the fact that there's this intersection that you are seeing and that you are incorporating into the work you're doing to help people to realize the importance of emotional intelligence in broaching those really critical conversations. So do you have any exciting projects or work that's coming up that you want to share with this community? What's going on?
Well, there are lots of things noodling around in my brain of work that I want to be doing. And I just, I would love to find one extra day in the week, I think, and I could do all the things I want to do. So I'm working on what Sharp Brain Consulting will be doing at the start of the year. My chief of staff and I are having some conversations about, what we want to be doing in order to really help advance, equity leadership in terms of the start of the year. So my recommendation in terms of staying aware of what we're doing is certainly, you can engage with us on social media, but get on our email listserv. We send emails out just twice a month, at least for now. And we update people on what we're doing because we are definitely working on some things that will come that will be able to be, y'all will be able to engage in at the start of the year.
No, that sounds fantastic. We look forward to all of that. And we'll definitely make sure in our follow-up communication that this community has ways to reach out to you and access to all of the great things that you're doing. And I'm just excited that you're sharing today with this community. So I want to go to the questions that the audience has. And so let me pull that up now. And okay, so I'm going to start with this question. I'm curious, in your experiences and study of the brain, do you find the biases come from discomfort or incomfort? Kind of like in learning, where adults stay in their own experiences and often reject new experiences. That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give you a little bit of like the neuroscience, and I'll try to do it quickly to make sure we have time for lots of questions, because I could talk about the brain just forever and I get all excited about it. So essentially the answer to your question is neither. and follow me, Diana, because I'll kind of explain them. So the biases are essentially activated all the time. So if I'm pre-COVID or post-COVID, if we ever get there, y'all, if I'm, walking down the street and someone is walking towards me and they are, it's clear to me, or at least I assume, right? Because, it's not always clear, but, I think that they are a Black woman, right? They're walking down the street. I'm walking down the street as a Black woman without me even consciously thinking about it. And within essentially milliseconds of my eyes landing on this other person, my brain has identified their race and their gender. And my brain has attached meaning to that person. Mm-hmm. So my brain has said, Black woman, here's the story Jessica believes about Black women because of lived experience, media, explicit and implicit messages, all kinds of stuff. And I have attached meaning to this person, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, my view is colored by the story that I believe. So it's happening all the time. Anytime I'm walking around seeing people, I'm noticing race and gender at a minimum. I'm saying, oh, it's this kind of person. I'm attaching meaning, right? And what is so important to know is that this is, again, the science is clear, this is all happening, but it doesn't mean that my interaction cannot be changed, right? It means that that's the base level, right? So I've said, Black women, here's the story I believe, awesome. But if I'm aware that I have biases that are, I have a negative story about white men, and I'm aware of that, then when I'm walking down the street and I see a white man, my brain's putting it in a category, attaching meaning, I can essentially try to engage my conscious mind and say, whoa, the story may or may not be true. Hold on, let's wait and interact with them. So Diana, the answer to your question is that biases are happening all the time, and we're basically putting people into categories all the time, and it's for a whole lot of reasons. I go into this a lot more. I have a bias presentation that I do, but essentially, it is because we are meaning-making beings. We make meaning out of everything. It's because we love stories. It's because our brain does so many things, and that our brain basically has to make some quick decisions, or we wouldn't be able to basically get anything done. So that was a little bit of a long answer to say it's happening all the time.
It is absolutely happening all the time. One of the ways that I like to talk about it is if we just imagine that we all have a record inside of us, and literally like a record, those little apparatus you would put onto the machine and put the needle on it, it would play back the music. I know I'm dating myself, and you're a millennial, so I really feel old right now.
I know what it is.
But you know what it is. And so hopefully this audience certainly gets my point. But imagine that each of us, we have this record that's inside of us, and everything that we've been exposed to has been keeping record. It's being stored. So whether it's accurate, inaccurate, right, wrong, it's being stored. And so any given moment, something can trigger something that's on our record, which will then enter into our psyche and our mindset, and then we act upon it. I'm going to do this quick exercise, and y'all bear with me because I think this is quite impactful for those who are really interested in deeply understanding this. But I often share with audiences that Folgers, so they have the slogan, the best part of waking up is, what's the end of that? Folgers in your cup. Everybody knows that, right? I know. Exactly. And so I always say, I'm going to sing a little tune for you and I want you to finish it. And it never fails. Everybody can finish it. And then I say, how many of you had Folgers today? And they're like, well, I had coffee, but I'm not sure if it's Folgers or not. And I'm like, well, this is not a trick question. They do still serve Folgers in the grocery store. But what I get them to realize is that Folgers retired that campaign decades ago. And I'm saying decades with an S. But the mere fact that we heard it, it's on our record. And all I had to do was just sing a little portion of the jingle and everybody finishes it. I know. It helps just to facilitate the thought that, yes, we have a record and lots are being stored. Generalities about people, stereotypes about people, negative experiences about people. And then if we're sitting in front of someone and we're a hiring manager and it happens to be someone that's part of that population, then it's natural for it to creep into our mindset. And then this bias can impact the decision that we may make about the fate of that individual, going forward. So that's why it's important. And bias also is not just against, it's also in favor of, and that can get us in trouble too. So talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, we can, again, it's like biases are stories. So we can have a really negative story or we can have a really, really positive story, right? And so it can, I mean, that positive story can create potentially, if you're in a leadership role, almost as many issues as the negative. Right. Because again, it colors how we see folks. So if I've got an employee and, they are, I have this just bias that basically is rooted and I mean, they're my favorite, right? We've all got people that we like, right? And I mean, anything that they do, I'm going to see it differently. And I'm potentially more likely to make excuses for them. I'm more likely to say, well, it's okay. Or to give them more basically chances to get things right. I mean, and it can create so many issues. I mean, because that positive story can be just as negative or negatively impact as that negative story. And so, it's just so critical that we are aware of the stories that we make up about groups of people. And when you do that implicit bias association test, because I'm assuming that everyone's going to do it, right? I'm forever a teacher giving homework. The way that it pops out, it has individual assessments. They've changed it in a few years, and it's fantastic. In that regard, it has different kind of categories. So if I took the gender assessment, it'll pop out and say, you have a preference for women. That allows me to say, what's the story I believe about men? But it also allows me to say, what's the story I believe about women? And then I can get even more nuanced and say, what do I believe about white women, about Black women? And I can begin to really understand, wow, I may have hypothetically a really, really positive story about Black women and a really negative story about white men, which can then impact how I see those groups of people. And again, can create issues when we're talking about the workplace.
Absolutely. We have affinity bias to people who are like us. And on the surface, it may feel like there's nothing wrong with that. But what it does is sometimes it can preclude us from seeing the necessity of reaching out to people who are outside of our network that are different from us and give them also an opportunity. And so, we have to be careful of it working both ways, either a bias against or even a bias for, because there's some consequences on both ends. So Diana's question is, how much of the subconscious biases is learned?
Yeah, and I'll try to answer this quickly because we've got a few more questions that I think are really, y'all have such great questions in this group here. Most of it, quite frankly, those biases are a combination, and and I don't think that it's a straight percentage, right? But it is coming from certainly our lived experience, right? So my experiences with groups of people, and so that's more kind of interpersonal and not necessarily learned, but it is, coming from things I've learned, in a school setting, implicitly, things I've learned from my family, from other adults in my life. So a good bit of it is learned, but it includes our personal interactions and our experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alan has a question. How do you account for or address biases within marginalized groups for the dominant culture?
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, Alan. So the reality is that marginalized groups of people, and when I say that, I'm thinking specifically, Black men. I'm thinking about members of the LGBTQ population, right? I'm thinking of these communities that have been marginalized for a long time. And if you look back at history, there are systems that essentially were created at a minimum with bias in mind, potentially some other things in mind, right? And so I think that in order to account for those things when we're thinking about culture, right? And we have to, and I'm going to give you kind of a two-part answer here. We have to, the language I use is we got to blow some systems up, right? We have to dig into organizations and systems, and we have to look through and say, whoa, all these systems, these policies, these practices are at a minimum biased, potentially racist, sexist, et cetera, right? And we have to rebuild from an equity mindset, and we've got to rebuild with equity in mind. And the thing is, Alan, it can be challenging for people in the dominant culture, right? Because, depending on, there's a racial identity theory that many of you might have heard of. And there are different basically levels. And if you are, if you're a white person who believes that, talking about race is racist, that you just really kind of can't fully conceptualize the impact of race in America, you may, one, think, well, systems aren't racist, right? There is no systemic racism. I've heard that very recently by, some folks in serious power in the world here, and it's just emphatically wrong, right? So you may, one, think that systems aren't racist, or you may think, well, we don't really need to sit and talk about that. And so, one of the things that I think is so important is that certainly, Nika and I and folks like us are going to beat the drum and say, we got to fix systems. But it requires people in dominant cultures to talk to other people in dominant cultures and say, listen, it is an imperative that we in the dominant culture do better. Because I can, say all day long that we have to do better by Black and brown communities. But if essentially, if being just very transparent, if a white person says that to a white person, oftentimes it lands a little bit differently. And so, we have to really look at systems from a different way. We've got to look at policies and practices. And then we've got to really push alongside systems and say, y'all, we have to do better,
Yes, I need for someone to type amen into the into the chat. But yes, I often say that where we sit determines what we see. And that's why it's also so important for people to get proximate to the issues, the issues of those who have these lived experiences of inequitable society and of unjust situations and systems. We talk often about people bias, and we spend a lot of time in this conversation about that. But as you pointed out, bias also exists in processes and policies, So even when I go in and I do assessments for clients, I want to see all of your assets. Let me see your employee handbook. Let me see all of your materials, because oftentimes there's bias all in it, We have to solve for it both with people and with process. So we're getting close to our time, but here's one more question. And this is from Jocelyn, I believe, this pronunciation, but from the organizational perspective, how could we facilitate the process of self-discovery and, more importantly, unlearn and relearn the biases that might hinder the unity and inclusion of workplace? I love that. We do have to unlearn miscommunication and misinformation sometimes in order to be able to activate the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one client who, basically he says, he's like, we are paying you because we need to unlearn a whole lot of stuff, right? And so I think, Jacqueline, your question is, by golly, it's so important, because so I think that there are several ways to do it, but I think that things like, diversity related conversations, bias trainings, I think that can hit on the piece of unlearning and relearning, right? We can say, listen, these are the things that we have to understand, that we have to learn. But it requires organizational leaders basically having lines in the sand where they say, listen, equity and justice is critical to our organization, right? And I tend to work more with organizations in the public sector, as I've mentioned, and I've said over and over again, in the public space and nonprofit schools, we have a duty. We don't actually have a choice. We have to lead equitable organizations, right? So I think that it requires leaders saying this matters, and we are going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to invest time and money in these efforts, which includes things, to Nika's point, like looking at employee handbooks, looking at policies. It does absolutely require training, because I can't expect someone to mitigate bias in their decision making if they don't even understand what bias is or understand how pervasive it is, right? It requires that organizations commit to creating inclusive cultures and commit to creating belonging, in their organization. And there's a really fantastic book that I am just pretty obsessed with. It's called Our Search for Belonging. It's by Howard Ross, who also does a lot of work around bias. And he talks a good bit about belonging, how to cultivate it, et cetera. But if we can do some of those things, right, if we can have leaders who are really committed to this work, if we can basically look at policies and practices and say, we're going to shift our policies and we're going to make sure our practices align, if we have training so that we can, again, unlearn and relearn, and if we can really focus on how do we create a culture of belonging in this organization where every single employee, regardless of their race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, can bring their full self to this organization, I think we're going to be all right.
I think we're going to be all right too, but I think we're going to be all right because we have people like you that are willing to change the world and to communicate and have the hard conversation so that we all can emerge better and stronger as a society. And so as we get close to wrapping up our hour, I just want to thank you. And I hope that you will take a moment, whether it's now or whether it's later, once we can send you the chat transcript, just to see how so much of what you shared is really resonating with this audience. Lots of messages of affirmation for you. And so we're just
thank y'all.
Yeah. And Natasha has put the book, Our Search for Belonging, into the chat. So it's going to be some great resources that are going to come out of this. So my final question of the day is, we've talked about a lot, but what have we not talked about that you really want to leave this audience with, that you have some energy and passion around?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I will leave this audience with something we have talked about, because it's just the thing that I spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to encourage us to try to be more empathetic, right? There is come to the D&I Summit, right? If the first 20 or 30 of you all who can email Nika can get a ticket. I'm really excited about hearing from that final speaker who's going to dig into empathy. Learn about empathy. There's, I'm sure that the speaker's got some resources. There's a fantastic Brene Brown video that I show. If you just Google Brene Brown on empathy, you'll find it. It hits on some hard topics just throughout the video, but it's really, really, really good. But the thing I'll leave you with is I just really encourage us to all try to be a little bit more empathetic.
I totally agree with that. Thank you so much. This has been such a rich, substantive hour full of so many nuggets. And I just can't wait to go back and be able to watch the replay myself as a student that time and not as a facilitator, so that I can learn from you. And Dr. Sharp, I'm calling you that very intentionally. I'm calling it into being.
Right. I've got a little bit less than 2 years, so very, very soon.
Yes, that is so exciting. And I'm so proud of you. You're doing amazing work. And I look forward to continue to support you in different capacities. But yeah, your energy has been such a breath of fresh air to this community today. And we're just grateful that you accommodated your schedule to spend some time with us. I always say that when people say yes and accept our invite, it really makes us feel seen, valued, and heard. And that is something that is a gift. And so thank you so very much. And thank you to this audience. As I was looking through where people were dialing in from, we have people from Brazil, from all sorts of places. And so this audience is growing, and I'm so excited about that. We will be back here next week, Eastern Standard Time, from 11 to 12 noon with Victoria Chance and Mary Ann Inglis. And so it'll be the first time that we'll have a duo pair serving as co-hosts, and they're going to be talking about their nonprofit, My Neighbor's Voice, and the intersection of what they're doing in their nonprofit with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I look forward to that. Be sure to anticipate a follow-up this afternoon that's going to have the replay link, as well as some of the key takeaways from our talk with Dr. Sharp. And again, do not forget that if you have not already, make sure that you email me if you are available and interested in attending the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit with the theme, amplify the I meaning inclusion starts within. And so I so look forward to engaging as many of you as possible in that opportunity. Thank you again, Dr. Sharp. You all have a great Friday and a great weekend. Thank you.